Okay guys, this is BTEC Psychology and this is Unit 3 and we're looking in this video at the learning approach for smoking. This is just basically a really quick recap for anyone that missed the lesson. The learning explanation of smoking, we're looking, remember, at how our environment around us can influence us into smoking. So things like watching other people and any rewards we receive and any ways in which we're conditioned. So let's look at that now. So the first stage we have to look at initiation, how an addiction begins. And in terms of learning theory for smoking, the social learning theory is a really good explanation for this. So as you know, in social learning theory, we talk about observing other people, and depending on the consequences of their actions, we would copy them or not, depending on if it was a positive consequence. So we would have role models such as parents and peers, and we would observe them smoking. If we can see that they are enjoying smoking, that's a positive consequence for the action of smoking. And therefore, vicarious reinforcement takes place. We see someone else have a positive consequence, and therefore we're more likely to copy them. So that's how social learning theory explains the start of smoking. You copy someone else. Operant conditioning also explains the start of smoking. So the idea is once you take your first puff of a cigarette, you get that immediate dopamine rush that we looked at in the biological approach, that rush of dopamine through the reward circuits in your brain, giving you a feeling of pleasure and euphoria. That acts as a reward, and therefore operant conditioning takes place. So because you have the reward for the action of smoking, you're more likely to repeat it, and therefore it develops into an addiction. Okay, maintenance. We've got two processes going on here. So firstly, positive reinforcement keeps happening. So every time you smoke a cigarette, it's rewarded, and therefore you're more likely to continue smoking. Negative reinforcement also happens to make the addiction continue. So basically every time you try to stop, you get withdrawal symptoms, which puts you into a negative state. That's a negative condition. And therefore smoking then takes you out of that negative state. So it reinforces the action of smoking. Equally, we have classical conditioning going on, which helps to maintain the behaviour. So let me just go to a sheet here to make this make sense. So what we've got is, in classical conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. In the case of smoking, that is nicotine leads to pleasure. That's just something that's kind of almost like a reflex response, something that happens naturally. If every time we have nicotine and experience pleasure, we also, let's imagine we drink a coffee at the same time. Before that you're doing that, the coffee would act as a neutral stimulus and lead to no response. However, if you continually pair those two things together, so if you always drink a coffee along with your morning cigarette, and that happens repeatedly, then what happens after conditioning is that coffee then becomes a conditioned stimulus. And it leads to the beginning of that pleasure response. It leads to a physical response, which is your conditioned response to a coffee. And so what that means is that causes cravings. So even without the presence of a cigarette, we begin to get that dopamine rush, and that makes us really, really want to smoke. So that's how something that's initially a neutral stimulus, and that could be anything, a smoking buddy, a time of day, it could be a place, but when you encounter that thing, it's become what's known as a conditioned cue, and therefore it causes cravings. So in terms of maintenance, we would talk about that in terms of it prompts the behaviour. So therefore the behaviour of smoking continues. You encounter your cue and it prompts the behaviour, and so you reach for a cigarette. In terms of relapse, we talk about the same thing. So we talk about having conditioned cues, but basically when they're trying to give up and they encounter those conditioned cues, it causes them to relapse because it causes that strong craving feelings. Okay, the last part of this is relapse, is self-efficacy rather. So self-efficacy, remember, is your belief in your ability to do something. And that's part of social learning theory, because if we have a role model who has managed to quit smoking, then we are more likely to imitate them. It increases our self-efficacy. Whereas if you know someone who has not managed, who's tried and failed to quit smoking lots of times, then that's going to reduce your self-efficacy as well. You're going to be less likely to succeed in quitting. Okay, so that is what you need to know for the learning explanation for smoking: how it begins, how it's maintained, and how we end up relapsing. Let's look briefly at some evaluation. So there are two strengths here that we're looking at. Firstly, it's been supported by a meta-analysis by Carter and Tiffany, where they reviewed lots of studies where basically people were exposed to their conditioned cues and it caused craving. They measured that scientifically, for example, by rating their level of craving beforehand and afterwards. So you could see the way in which the conditioned cues were causing cravings. The other strength for learning theory of smoking is practical applications. You can use this knowledge about these conditioned cues to do what's known as counter conditioning, and that's something called aversion therapy, where you use the theory of conditioning to make a more negative association with smoking. So basically, you use something called rapid smoking, which makes people throw up by smoking lots and lots and lots of cigarettes really, really quickly. And then, therefore, they have a negative association with smoking. So we've used that knowledge of the way that conditioning can make someone be addicted to smoking and used it to our advantage to help develop like a treatment for smoking addiction to help people to quit. So that's something that's positive that's come out of the learning theory. A weakness of the learning theory for smoking is that it doesn't explain why people react differently to the same stimuli. So, for example, if you grow up in a smoking family, then learning theory suggests that you ought to become addicted to smoking because you've seen the role models of your parents enjoying smoking, etc. However, lots of people from smoking families don't smoke, and learning theory can't explain that. The other thing it can't it's incomplete, is our second weakness, because it's ignoring biological factors. And a really good thing you can do here is compare the learning theory for smoking to the biological theory. So you can say that the learning theory, I've put an example on the screen here, the learning theory is incomplete because it only looks at environmental factors and it's ignoring biological factors. And so therefore it can't, because we know there are various ways that smoking affects us biologically, therefore learning theory is not complete. Okay, that's it.